Today, I have special guests Sherry Gaba and Carla Romo. You may know Sherry as the go-to expert alongside Dr. Drew Pinsky on VH1's number one celebrity Rehab, or have seen her on Access Live, the Bio Channel, Showbiz Tonight, any one of those places, talking about her best-selling book, Love Smacked: How to Stop the Cycle of Relationship Addiction and Codependency to Find Everlasting Love. Carla is a renowned dating and relationship coach and author of Contagious Love and an international speaker. The two of them make a dynamic duo as the Love Fix podcast hosts, where they have conversations about dating, codependency, and toxic relationships. And I wanted to bring them on to get a fresh perspective and new insight to help you on those topics. So, why don't we just start right there? Let's talk about toxic relationships, because usually that's what most people are coming to these for. And because you both have a unique perspective, Sherry, you're the younger one. Yeah, I'm just kidding.
Thank you so much,
Sherry,
Sherry.
you know the younger audience, and Carla, you know the old. But seriously, you both have unique perspectives and different clientele. What would you say for each of you is the biggest reason people get drawn to toxic relationships?
Mm. Well, I would start out by saying it's all rooted in low self-esteem. And a lot of codependency stems, if we're going to look at it from a lens of codependency, it stems from childhood. Sherry can definitely talk more on that from a therapy perspective. And a lot of times we think about people who are low self-esteem, people who aren't go-getters, who aren't high achievers. But I will tell you right now, lots of people are high functioning in toxic relationships, are high functioning in their codependency. I was high functioning in my codependency, extremely high functioning. You probably would have looked at me and thought, wow, she seems to have her life together. Yes, because that is the disease of codependency. Codependency isn't actually a disease. So when I say that, it's kind of a way of a lot of people who kind of look at codependency as almost like a disease-like thing. But I mean, you could have looked at me and thought, wow, she must really have it together. She must really feel good about herself. But that is one of the symptoms of codependency is let's make sure everything looks really good on the outside because I feel like shit on the inside. And I don't want anyone to see that or anyone to know that.
That's what PMLity, and that's what I love that you said that, because most people that talk about codependency never talk about, you called them the high functioning. PMLity calls them the falsely empowered. And so what people don't realize is what we hold up as the most normal, healthy, adjusted adult is the uber successful person. And they are just as severely codependent as our typical, what she calls the disempowered codependent. Everyone thinks it's nice, gets run over, but the high achieving person, they are in severe dysfunction. Then, as you said, it's all outside esteem, other esteem. They're pursuing, whether it's career, whether it's possessions, anything to justify and hide the fact that inside they're hurting so deeply. So,
when you say that, Kenny, it makes me think about the codependent narcissist dance or the toxic individual codependent dance, because we know narcissists have to look good on the outside too. And they both are really, two sides of the same coin. They both usually have severe abandonment issues, the codependent being the giver and the narcissist being the taker. So it's just a very fascinating thing how that, you can be at a party and they're just going to sort of be a magnet for each other. They really do attract each other to each other. But Carla talks about self-esteem. I couldn't agree more. And then I talk from the lens of trauma, right? So if you grow up, and it doesn't always have to be the case, but if you grow up and you have parents that aren't available or abandon you, or they were addicts or alcoholics, or sometimes we talk about the parentified child where, let's say your parents were divorced and one parent makes their child their little adult friend, then you feel pretty invisible because it's not about the little child anymore. It's about the parent. And then they grow up to be adults and they're like, oh, okay, well, I don't know who I am. And I never had that bonding that I needed. So I'm just going to focus on everything outside of me. Yeah. And then, of course, they're going to be more vulnerable to a toxic person. And Carla describes this much better. We had a guest on the Love Fix. That's Carla and my podcast together. And which I think we already mentioned, but I'm just mentioning it again. Love Fix, Love Fix. Go to the Love Fix.
The Love Fix. Go to Love Fix now.
Yeah, the Love Fix. But, Carla describes this one guest that we had about how, like, it doesn't always have to be where you had this, like, traumatized childhood because, I'm sure all three of us have had clients where my childhood was fine and it might have really been fine, but somehow they ended up in these toxic relationships. So maybe you could talk about that guest, Carla, where she talked about these
Yeah.
other things.
Well, what was interesting is that they didn't have any trauma. She's a leading expert. She did her research out of Purdue, and it was all around psychopaths. And she classified narcissists as psychopaths. And she said that sociopaths don't actually exist in her research. That she found that it's all just under the umbrella of psychopaths. And what she found was that there was a personality trait of people who didn't have anything from their childhood, but had a personality trait. If you were to look at a scale of empathy, one end of empathy being extremely empathetic, the other being not empathetic at all. And what she found is if you took like a little like thing and put it right in the middle, right, that the people who were attracting these psychopaths that were in these codependent relationships were just one tick toward empathy. So these weren't these like extremely empathetic people. These were people who were just one tick over. The other thing too, I think to look at here with codependency, and Sherry talks a lot about generational trauma, is that you could have had parents who were not addicts. Okay. I'm going to use addiction because that is a perfect, dysfunction for codependency. And so you could have had parents who had parents that were addicts. So they pick up the codependent traits and then they pass it down to you. And so you're like, why am I attracting all these people? Like, why do I like addicts so much? Well, because you have all these people pleasing, these lack of boundaries, all of these traits that are codependent. And Sherry, like I said, she talks a lot about the generational trauma piece where it's passed down through generations. It's not always just immediate mom, dad, family dynamic.
Yeah, I remember going to my first ACOA meeting and I'm like, oh my God, there's a laundry list. And I'm like, whoa. Now, my mom isn't an alcoholic, although later in life, she was an alcoholic. It just hadn't been activated. But growing up, she was fine. But I'm like, why can I relate to all these things? Well, I had grandparents that were gamblers, both of them. And she was a child of that trauma. And thus she passed down, her trait of codependency to me.
Yeah.
And so it wasn't like my mother was this raging alcoholic, at least when I was growing up. Later on, she became one. But yeah, and then I would go as far as to say there's our lineage, like this isn't really a therapeutic lens. It's more of what I believe in a spiritual sense that it's passed down through our ancestors. So, if you look at your DNA and they call it epigenetics, Bruce Lipton talks a lot about this. These things are passed down. I mean, think about addiction of a substance, how that's passed down. Well, the other things can be passed down too. Love addiction, codependency, and all the other type. It just depends on how it manifests.
Yeah, and what you described, about your mother, she, wasn't active in her addiction. She was a alcoholic in different ways. She was, she just wasn't using alcohol yet.
And
And
she had
so
the
that's where, like, your expert and I probably would have, I mean, I wouldn't have yelled and screamed. I'm being silly, but to me, any expert who says that somebody didn't go through childhood trauma is so detached from reality. That's a nearly narcissistic view of parenting and their own parents and them as a parent. Because to be human is to make mistakes. Every parent makes mistakes. And even the slightest mistake leaves trauma. A perfect example from my childhood is I was just reaching into the fridge to grab cottage cheese to get something to eat. And my mom comes screaming over, no, that's for the dogs. Well, my mom was on a strict food. My dad was building this kingdom, didn't have much money. My mom struggled managing money. And so, she had 4 kids within 5 years of each other. We were all athletes. We ate like horses. So my mom was constantly stressed about money and how much we ate. And also, she would use the cottage cheese to hide the dogs' pills when they were sick. Well, because we don't teach how emotions transfer and what trauma really is, that moment, and anyone watching, any so-called expert would say, oh, that's not trauma. You didn't get beat, you didn't get abused, she just raised her voice, all of that. Well, here's the consequence. For 30 years, I starved myself. I was playing pro hockey, living off super big gulps and eating ding dongs. If you asked me to go to eat, I'd say I hate eating. Eating bores me. Like, I hated to eat. I never made the connection that in that moment, what I heard my mom say was, if you eat, you get in trouble. If you eat, you're a bad child. And oh, by the way, in this house, we feed the dogs before we feed the children. Did my mom say any of that? No. But that's how easy trauma happens. So and that's one of the reasons I started this business, is people are so detached from reality. Every single person on this planet goes through horrific trauma in childhood, even in the best childhoods. Another way to equate it is Tom Brady might be considered the greatest athlete that's ever walked this planet. And here's a person who for 40 years worked with experts on how to throw the ball, his body, his mind. He was surrounded by coaches who were experts. So imagine parents who'd taken all the parenting classes, 6 or 8 of them, like with just one child as the focus. Yet every single day he throws incompletions, interceptions, fumbles, he screws up nonstop. And so for us as parents, or to look back at our parents and go, oh no, my childhood was fine, I didn't go through trauma, is so detached from reality and so narcissistic in its oblivion to reality. Not that they're, truly narcissistic.
I think there's
but the point is we classify trauma as only severe. And that is traumatic. But little trauma has deep, lasting impact. And to minimize that is a disservice to us all, because that like any single person that comes up with any problem, I can, in 3 questions, I can show them that's childhood. When mom, dad rolled his eyes, that's the moment you learned you were stupid. And we would never call that trauma. And so
I would agree. There's little trauma, there's big trauma. I mean, I think this expert was right on, because there are people that really, even if they had trauma and they don't recognize it, it would be very minimizing for them to feel like, oh, well, then I'm not, I didn't. You have to meet your client where they are. Like
I don't disagree with that. I'm just trying to lift seeing right there, it'd be minimizing. So we have this, oh, I don't want to say I had trauma. Well, that right there is a disconnect. You can't have self-esteem because you're not accepting that you're human and limited, and that we all are fallible, but we place this expectation of, oh, I'm not one of those, like they're worse than me. And I'm going, no, we're all in this together. We're all hurting. Like we keep creating that separation. And that's what I'm trying to get rid of is, we all hurt and we all express it in different ways. Let's quit placing people in these categories that, well, they're better because they haven't been through. I'm like, that's not even true. That's all I'm after.
Yeah, we had a trauma expert on the podcast who I forget exactly who it was, but we talked a lot about how trauma is just the way you process the information. So your cottage cheese experience, if your sibling was there, may not have processed it as trauma. And so I think, and that's what's kind of fascinating about trauma, right? Whether it's big trauma, little trauma, that kind of thing, it's really about how does our brain process it. I do believe that there are people who grew up and maybe really didn't have any type of familial trauma in their childhood. I mean, I really do believe that, because I don't think everybody came from necessarily dysfunction. Now, I think there's dysfunction in everything. But whether somebody's brain processed it as trauma or not could be very different, because you can look at 2 siblings who grew up in the same household and experienced similar life events, and that one of them feels that was a traumatic event and the other one experienced it completely different. Yeah. So, but I hear exactly what you're saying, Kenny, here, where it's important to take away the stigma around there's this like difference of like the big trauma. Well, they went to war, they did this, so there's no way I could have trauma. And I think that it's just the way, if you kind of take a step back and can detach from the emotional part of it, trauma is just the way our brain processes it. And then as humans, we try to survive and have some characteristics that come out in codependency and other things like that, that, can be harmful to us as a result of the trauma.
And I think for this expert, I think she really wanted to help people that were feeling like I was trying to say earlier, they were being minimized. Like, oh, I didn't have that kind of childhood, but I'm still attracting toxic people. What is wrong with me? There's nothing wrong with you. You just you might be high on that empathy scale. We just have to, like I said, meet the client where they are, and we have to acknowledge their experience.
That's a great point. I want to touch on something, then I want to turn that into a question of, that's what I'm after, is because we grade things, that's why they feel minimized. Because it's not okay that I grew up, that I am imperfect. See, a hallmark of low self-esteem is the inability to recognize I'm human, I'm limited, I can't do everything. And if I pick somebody, it doesn't make me a bad person. It's just part of life. I'm going to be fallible, and therefore I'm not bad. But since we create this segregation, that's where that person goes. They're devaluing themselves. And that's why, to me, that approach doesn't help them, because it doesn't bring them into reality and get them to accept that it's okay. You're okay. And it's just a difference in opinion of how to get them to accept themselves and not shame themselves. But you bring up a great point. When clients come in that can't see reality, whether they played a part in it or didn't play a part in it, and you brought up meeting them where they are. What are some skills? Because I know there are people in here, a lot of people watch my stuff and go, he's so crazy. That's not me. And I didn't go through that. And in most cases, those are people that can't see themselves and can't see this stuff. When you guys work with clients, and it's just, I don't know, there's a tattoo on their forehead that says, I'm codependent or whatever. And you put them in front of the mirror and they're going like, no, that's a smiley face. Like, what are ways that or suggestions you have for people in that situation to help them, whether it's something you do or somebody listening might be going, I wonder if that's me. How would you help them get over that bridge?
Okay, well, I'll talk from a therapy point of view. First you're assessing their mental health, right? You're not really coaching them or telling them anything. Your coach is a little different. You're guiding them to take action, blah, blah, blah. So we're going through their family of origin. And then, when you start going through some of these things that have happened, then you can see, oh, that might be part of why, you tend to do this pleasing. I would never label it codependency, because I never want anyone to feel like they have a label. I might explain what codependency is, and then I'll talk about the fawn response, like what Carla was saying. It's a way we process emotions, and the way you're doing it is by fawning. But really, as a therapist, I want to bring them to discover what's going on from their family of origin and past relationships. Like, let's say they are hypervigilant. Oh, well, when they start talking about a series of toxic relationships, well, those are some of the responses when you have PTSD, which you may have. Now, from a coach, Carla, you may approach it differently.
Yeah, completely differently. I mean, I only work with people who are ready to make change. So, and not saying that you're going to therapy, you're not ready to make a change, but coaching is very much about moving you from point A to point B. So you're coming to me because you say, wow, Carla, I keep getting in these toxic relationship patterns. I just want out of them. Like, I want to be able to date where I feel confident, or I want to love myself during the dating process, or I want clarity around the relationship that I'm in, whether it's the right relationship or not. And so from there, we kind of talk a little bit about it. It would be unethical for me as a coach to say, you are a codependent. What I do suggest is I say, have you ever considered, yourself to be codependent? Let me share what the definition of codependency is and explain that, there's multiple, but this is the way I would define it. It sounds like maybe there's some characteristics there. So I would never be like, you are codependent, but I can say, even just from my own experience, that when my therapist, months after seeing her, this was years ago, part of my breaking free from codependency, she said to me, you're a codependent. And at the time I was so codependent that I was like, not going to ask her what that meant, and went home and Googled it. And once I realized, wow, yeah, I am codependent. This really checks out. This is me. And I have to say, it was really freeing for me to be able to label it and take ownership, because then I thought, I have steps to take. So, what I hear Sherry saying, though, I think is super important, is that you're not just, coming in and people, you're a codependent, you're this, you're that, because there is no trust or safety at that point. And it feels very vulnerable when you're in a session. And I would say I want to build safety and trust as well with all of my clients, regardless of what they're coming to me for.
And there used to be some type of therapy, and I don't even know what you called it, where you would like manufacture things that didn't happen. And that's a very dangerous thing. Where I don't even know what it's called, because it's not anything in my wheelhouse. It's basically, oh, well, you must have been molested, or you must, and then they're supposed to go back and find these memories that don't even really exist. So you have to be very careful when you're in the room with someone, not to, they need to find these answers. They need to figure these things out without pointing the finger that, oh, this must have happened to you. Oh, that person must have been abusive to you. They have to talk about what happened. And then you go, oh, well, that could be considered abusive. Anyway, does that make sense?
Yeah, well, in a sense, what I hear is the same approach in two different ways, and also two different clients. What I hear, Sherry, is, a client coming in who's struggling and doesn't really know what's going on. They just know something isn't right, but not well versed in what the potential not rights are. And, in a therapeutic environment, you're right, it's walking them into the answer. And when people hear themselves talk and then you give them their words back, all of a sudden they're like, something about that doesn't sound right. I never noticed that before. And so they, in a sense, create their own awakening. Whereas in Carla's instance, that's probably somebody that's already been to a therapist or been reading books. They're coming in from a different approach of, okay, I think these are my struggles. How do I fix them? Well, that's complete, there's a hunger difference and an awareness difference. And so the process would be a bit different, in those two approaches,
I mean, this is why everybody thinks they're a therapist. If you go on Instagram, for instance, everybody has all this information out there. That's fine. That information's fine, but that is not therapy. That is a post on Instagram. I mean, it's really interesting and it's educational, but it's not where the healing. It's the awareness to move towards healing, but it is certainly not the healing. And I think we have to just be really careful.
I couldn't agree, because even with my posts, I have a lot of people that reach out to me and they're trying to coach and counsel themselves through people's videos, and 15-second, some of the comments on my short videos are meant to be, here's a little bit of information. You want the full thing, go watch the full video, which most of my videos are 30 to 60 minutes long. Well, people don't watch that. They watch 15 seconds and then they, just go off, or, that's wrong, this is right, whatever. And it's like, wait a minute, do you realize you're trying to find a solution to narcissism in a 15-second video, and moving from one to the next? And to understand these dynamics, takes years of work on yourself, years of studying and understanding. Yet that's the downside to the internet.
The work never ends. Like, it's a journey, right? Like, that's the thing. And even from the expert side, okay, so the journey of doing the work and going to therapy is a lifelong process, right? If you're committed to it, there's no quick fix. There is fixes. I don't want to say you need to be fixed, but there are ways to cope and to get out of trauma and to get out of your codependency and toxic relationships. But from the expert side as well, therapy is always shifting and changing and evolving. Coaching is always shifting, changing, and evolving. And so I think what is important here is that people realize that if you want to make changes in your life, you have, going to therapy and coaching is not just like an Instagram post, isn't just a quick thing. It's working on yourself to actually change the wiring in your brain. That doesn't just happen through awareness. You have to get out there and practice it in action.
Yeah, exactly. Because I think people don't realize that the person you are who is struggling is watching this content. Well, that means you can only process it through your previous life experiences, which have been toxic. And so you won't hear the solution or the nugget because you don't have the recovery to hear the truth yet, because the dysfunction is still running your life. You want to be this person, but to be this person, you need somebody who's done the work to get there and can walk you to that. And that's, to me, is the disconnect. They're processing from a place of that's already struggling. Well, you can't hear what it is you need to hear from this place, and you're going to project onto whatever you're hearing from here. But what you're after is this perspective. Well, that takes, as you said, work. You have to do the
Even
work.
worse than social media. Now people are getting answers from artificial intelligence.
Yeah. Isn't that crazy?
I mean, that's really scary. And then there's these organizations that do this therapy, you know, online for 15 minutes, blah, blah, blah. I mean, I don't want to be a naysayer of all the different things that are out there, but I just want people to be discerning. Be discerning when you hire a coach.
And that's the problem. When you're here, you don't know how to be discerning. That's the difficulty. And that's why these things work, is because obviously, I mean, they're struggling with discernment because of, the toxicity in their life. That's one of the things. Well, that takes new knowledge, but you have to work with somebody individually. You can't get there on your own. What would you say for the two of you, and kind of building off of that, dating now on both sides of the aisle, whether you're man or woman, is pure crazy. And it's just a whole new landscape. We used to date basically within a 10-mile radius of ourselves. Now we have access to people anywhere in the world. What's the most common problem each of you see when people come to you for dating advice or, suggestions? And what are the solutions you have for somebody like that? So it's two questions. What's the most common problem you're seeing? And then, what sort of solutions do you have?
I'm going to let Carla do the dating piece because she's the dating and relationship coach.
Hey, all right. From the dating perspective, so I'm going to get pretty deep here. I'm going to start at the surface and then we're going to get really deep. So the surface level is I just keep picking the same people over and over again. I'm perpetually single. My friends and family say I'm too picky. I don't listen to the red flags. Okay. Right. Surface level. What's really at the core? I don't feel lovable. I'm not enough. I'm not worthy. I'm not special. Nobody will ever want me. I don't like myself so much that I'm going to do a self-fulfilling prophecy and I'm going to pick subconsciously all these people who will never work out and I'm going to criticize the shit out of them. So then it never works out and I'm alone, right? Like that is the core of what I actually really see going on. What it looks like on the surface is everything that I just described in the very beginning. So I think at the end of the day, we're human. Like we all want connection. That is like the number one desire of human beings is connection and belonging. And if you don't have a personality disorder, which would be narcissism or psychopaths. So the way I look at that is that we want this belonging. However, somewhere in our childhood or trauma or whatever past relationships that have accumulated trauma, we become disconnected to ourselves. And so we don't even know what that connection looks like. And if we can't connect to ourselves, then we can't connect to other people in a healthy way. It's not possible.
Yeah, we don't know how to have an intimate relationship with ourselves. I mean, I remember the awakening, and I see this with my clients. Oh, they're all unavailable. They're all emotionally unavailable. Well, most likely you're emotionally unavailable with yourself. And so if you can't have a healthy relationship with yourself, you're certainly not going to know how to have an intimate relationship with someone who's healthy, because a healthy person's probably going to repulse you. I mean, and I'll do this thing where I'll say, just imagine that person who's really nice doesn't mirror your parents, your parents' toxicity. They're actually a healthy person. Ooh, imagine, they're coming closer and literally when they think of it, they go like, oh my God, yuck. Ooh. And that is what dating is for people that are not healthy. They cannot get comfortable with another healthy person because they themselves have not done the work.
That reminds me of when I've been doing work on myself for years, but it really started when I met Mike Pinkston. And I remember asking him, you know, when will I start picking normal women? You know, because everything was so toxic. I mean, my first wife was physically and verbally abusive. It was just awful stuff. And he goes, you know, Kenny, those women that right now you find boring, when you start attracting them, that's when you'll know you've done the healing work. And I remember without pause, I just yelled the F word at him. And I was like, there's no way. Well, now here I'm on the other side. I see that toxic. I'm like, oh, she's so fun, but she'll kill me. No, thank you. You know, but
I have a similar
yeah,
instance to this,
please
like
tell it.
story.
Yeah.
So the original therapist that I was talking about, the one that said I was codependent, this was over a decade ago, by the way. Okay. That I was sitting in this therapist's office and she said to me, I was telling her, oh, like I need to find somebody who's fucked up. And she's like, well, why? And I said, because I'm fucked up. So I need to find somebody who's also fucked up because I just can't be with somebody who's normal like that. They just won't get me. And then she reminded me of that 5 years later when I was no longer in codependent relationships that I had said that. And I just looked at her and I was like, weren't you concerned about me? Like, that's fucking scary. She was like, no, I knew you'd come around and you did. So like, you know, I get that. It's scary when you realize, oh shit. Like,
Actually, people think that they have to match somebody else's neuroses. If my neuroses matches your neuroses, then we must be a match,
Yes.
which, you know, of course, is not the case. But it takes work to have to look at yourself. And going back to the dating, we often pick what we know, right? So,
Yeah.
you know, if we had abusive parents, verbally abusive, physically abusive, alcoholic, whatever, then we're often going to find that. I see it all the time. I've been in this business for 30 years and more often than not, they're picking someone that was a caregiver's personality.
Yeah. We learn relationship from our parents and then we model it. And that's why at least in my life experience, I have not seen one case of a person who ended up with somebody toxic where there was not toxicity in their childhood. The biggest disconnect is they've created that I wasn't traumatized, childhood was fine. That's their biggest stumbling block, is they're not in reality of, oh, and mostly not in reality because we don't teach and talk about, you know, wait a minute, did you know this parenting, although your parents were well intended and did the best they could, they're human, they're limited, but that behavior, that's what has you stuck. And until you get into reality on that,
And there may be someone out there saying, well, is my relationship healthy or is my dating healthy? If they want, they can actually take a quiz. Are my relationships healthy?
Yeah, please tell.
Yeah. Go to thelovefix.com and it's they're going to get a workbook on are my relationships healthy? They can take a quiz. Are my relationships healthy? They can get on our waiting list for our upcoming coaching programs. Yeah, go to thelovefix.com, get on our waiting list and just, you know.
What's the best client for you? If there are people listening, for the content that you have and you've created in your skill set, who should be reaching out to you?
So we've got,
well,
yeah,
I want to do it separate because you both help differently. So I want to see like who.
Okay.
For
On a
Sherry first,
collective.
and then I'm going to go to you,
Yeah.
Carla.
Well, on the collective, we do have group coaching for the Love Fix, which, you know, there's a wait list. So you can go to thelovefix.com, sign up for the group coaching. This is for anybody. You can be single, dating, in a relationship, going through divorce, breakup. It doesn't matter. If you have been in or in an unhealthy relationship and you're ready to be in healthy relationships and you want the building blocks and the steps to do that, we are coming out with a really comprehensive group coaching program. It's going to be live. So Sherry and I will also be the coaches on that group coaching program. We've got tons of modules, workbooks, lots of stuff for that. So anybody who's just really ready to like learn about what healthy relationships are, ready to step in to healthy relationships, curious about healthy relationships, that is our clientele. And then Sherry, do you want to talk about your individual stuff?
Often I see people that have a history of some kind of trauma. So my modalities are somatic experiencing, which is discharging energy in your body from trauma. I do a little bit of polyvagal theory. I do some tapping. So often it's trauma. And then, of course, your everyday walking wounded, or depression, anxiety. And then I do get a lot of people that are struggling with toxic relationships. I mean, they seem to find me, which, and codependency and love addiction. So I would say, as a therapist, when you're licensed, you can do many things, but I seem to be geared towards codependency, toxic relationships, and love addiction and trauma.
all wrapped under the umbrella of trauma as part of the healing process. Am I hearing you right?
Most of the time, yes. Yes.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Carla,
And,
yourself, what
yeah. So, if people are wanting to work one-on-one, I help men and women who are feeling stuck. They're feeling stuck and stagnant, whether that is somebody who is dating right now, can't seem to get into the relationships they want, or coming out of unhealthy relationships, ready to step into healthy relationships. I also help people work through their breakups so that they're not repeating certain behaviors, or they're just going through the grieving process. And then, the other thing as well is I do help people who are in relationships who are working toward healthy relationships. I do other coaching too outside of that, life coaching, life purpose, transition, that kind of thing. But in terms of the dating and relationship side, I'm really big on self-love. Like, I believe everything is rooted in a self-love journey, and that's the connection to self. So a lot of my coaching is getting people into that place of connection to self so then they can flourish and have really awesome, healthy relationships.
Okay. So similar to Sherry, there's an umbrella there. Underneath the umbrella for Sherry is like trauma. For you, it's reattachment to the self. It's self-love. It's, I can't give you what I don't possess. And so you help them get that. So regardless of what they're struggling with, that's always a foundational piece we need.
Exactly.
And both
Absolutely.
of you. So it makes sense why you two are together, because those are the two things you need. You need trauma work and you need self-esteem work, at least in my experience. So it's a great yin yang, from those are two foundational steps that if people were to work with you, you can't do this work without those.
Yeah.
And it explains why you two are so good together. Is there anything else you'd like to tell the audience before we wrap up here, of a suggestion or something of yours that could help them? I'll leave it to you guys as to kind of closing words, what you'd like to share.
Go ahead, Sherry.
I would say just no shame or blame. I got into this codependency field because I wanted people not to feel ashamed for and I don't mean just codependency, love addiction, toxic relationships. They've had many relationships and they feel shame about it. So don't feel ashamed or blame. There's reasons that this happened. And there's always a beginner's mind, always starting anew. So that would be my little.
Beautifully said.
The other thing too is that, the first step is awareness, but in order to create change in your life, you have to take that step forward, which can feel really scary. But I always like to use this cliff analogy. It's like you feel like you're on the edge of the cliff, but what you don't realize is once you jump, there's a 2-foot net right underneath you. So life's never going to drop you. There's no right, perfect timing to start this work, and it's a journey. So there's no destination, there's no ending to it. There's just a baseline of functioning relationships, which the three of us have all been able to get to.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing. There you go. Please head over to the Love Fix podcast. Obviously, you can see there's a lot of information here that can help you when it comes to relationships, codependency, toxic relationships, self-love, childhood trauma. All things that I speak and talk about. And so you can get a fresh voice and new ideas, new perspectives. I'm a huge believer in trying as many different modalities and learning from as many different teachers as possible, because they may use words in a way that you need to hear them. And that's what matters. And all I care about is that you hear them. So once again, please check out both Sherry and Carla at the Love Fix podcast. And thank you, ladies, for coming on and sharing your strength, wisdom, and hope with everybody. I appreciate you coming and helping us.